that our education in the United States is so bent on this sort of like liberal utopia where everybody's gonna can get along, as everybody's like the same, and like we all, at the deep down have the same core values, and that people in the United States can't picture the idea that Europe was for hundreds, if not 1,000+ years, warring fiefdoms, with very distinct cultures, with very and like
Yeah.
and and not to say that Europeans like hate each other and like whatnot, but they shit on each other a lot. Like it's not like
It's not like California and Alabama, I'll tell you that much.
no,
Right?
there's not this
Like
unified
there,
thing.
like between California and Alabama, like there's like a lot of like teasing or whatever,
Sure.
or making fun of each other's accents or whatever. Like it is very different if you've been at war with somebody for like 200 years, right?
Exactly.
Like people don't fully appreciate like what that means, and culturally, right? Like generations upon generations just slaughtering each other. Even before the national state was born, by the way. So like Balkans, right? Like Greece is part of the Balkans. Like what is the expression to Balkanize, right? Like this thing it was like this like big region, right? And really it wasn't just the Balkans, it was like Anatolia, like modern day Turkey, the Middle East. It was just like this mosaic of people. Like a village could have like 10% Jews and 20% Armenians and 5% Greeks and 60% Turks or whatever. Right. And really they didn't even think of themselves as Turks and Greeks. They thought of themselves as Christians and Muslims or whatever, right? Like it wasn't even that clear cut. And at some point they just drew lines and like, we are the state of this country or the state of that country. And, you get exchange of populations. So my grandparents from my mother's side were, Greeks, we would say today. They were Orthodox Christians in modern day Turkey who were kicked out, but they spoke Turkish, right?
Yeah.
So then they come to Greece and everybody's like, you guys are Turks. They're like, no, like they specifically kicked us out of there because we're not, right? So, and then I met this guy playing, online sort of, I think Risk or something on Facebook back in the day. And he was like, yeah, and my grandmother was like deported to Turkey, even though she was speaking Greek until she was 101, right? Because she was Muslim. So it's just like, the degree of interconnectedness of all the people in these areas. And, when we learn history in Greece, like we learn history, right? It goes to 4000 BC. And we learn all of the reasons to be angry at everybody throughout time, right? And I'm sure everybody else is the same. So it's not like U.S. history where it's like, 1786 or whatever it is, that 1787.
Yeah, there was the Egyptians, and then there were the Greeks, and then there were the Romans,
like,
and then there was the American revolutions.
Greeks and Iranians still hate each other for stuff that happened like 2,500 years ago. Like
Yeah, Americans have no. I mean, I didn't have any sense of that. At least until my 20s, and it was like when I just started reading independently, and like it was like, holy shit. You meet people from other countries, and like, well, you guys aren't exactly the same as we don't all have these independent values.
And by the way, that's the thing, right? You hate each other, but then like you'll meet each other, like I don't know, being students in the UK, right? And you realize that you're like very similar to each other and very different from the Brits. Right, or whatever. So you gotta have beers, have fun, or what. So again, it's just very, very multidimensional, and it always happens that way. But if you're not in it, it's very, very easy to mistake that for, I saw this thing, I just could not get over it, and like it's petty, right? So people are gonna be like, really, that's the thing that pisses you off, but somehow, this thing that was going around, which is like, oh, white people have plain food. Right, or whatever.
Yes.
And I was like, no, we don't. I was like, oh wait, am I not? Like it just gets really complicated really quickly. Just asking a simple question like, is do white people have bland food? I don't know if they're Brits, maybe. Right.
Well, but it's like back in the day, like people who were from the Mediterranean area weren't considered white. Like, no, I mean, Italians weren't considered white.
There was this law actually passed in Australia that was like, with very careful selection, perhaps we can let in some Greeks.
Yeah, it is funny how the window of like how people think of who, like Jews are white now. Jews were never white, 50, 100 years ago. They were Jews, right? Like And even now I'm seeing on some social media, it's like that Asians are now effectively white people. How
Right.
does how does that work? I don't.
Well, it just tells you something, right? The label is functioning differently than what it sounds like.
Than what I grew up with, right?
Right.
For sure.
Yeah, and it's sad a little bit. Like you're forced to think about people like in terms of this is gonna sound really weird, but like I had this friend of mine in the UK, right? Who's like his dad was from Nigeria, right? So presentationally he's
Yeah,
black, but like he grew up with his mom, like who was like I don't know, like Irish or something. So like
yeah,
I just didn't think about it, right? We just hung out, and then I was
yeah.
like, hey, Jim is black. Like not that I didn't know what he looked like, obviously, but like I just hadn't classified it that way, and then like yeah,
Yeah.
it just becomes a thing, right? And then you start thinking about stuff, and you're like, ugh. But like, I just don't register him that way because culturally, he's not different than like any other person
I I had
I
the
would
same
meet.
experience. I mean, I grew up in New Hampshire, so almost everybody was white. There was like one black kid, and then there was a Mexican girl whose family owned like the Mexican restaurant in our grade school and high school. Like that was the racial diversity in southern New Hampshire. And then I went to college, and it was sort of weird because like the black kids, like we were trying to rush this black kid into my fraternity, and like it was this, oh, it was like, oh, you can't really do that because your friends will ostracize you because there's sort of this barrier. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Never, and then obviously as I got older, I was like, oh, okay, there's a whole bunch of conflict through these things that I wasn't aware of whatsoever. But
Yeah,
yeah, it is very strange how those things sort of manifest themselves. And like I feel like these days it's gotten as odd as I can imagine. Like I just can't.
the what I find fascinating is that again, just to go back to ivermectin, just because that's the topic I've been digging into, is how research from different countries is perceived as being less than
Mm-hmm.
or better than because like well this study was done in Nigeria or this study was done in Brazil or this study was done in Mexico or whatever. And
Yep.
people won't come out and say it that they think it's fraudulent just because it was done, in a what did Trump call it? Yeah, that country. But like you kind of get the vibe, and they'll tell you in hushed tones in private that like, well, if it's not really from like a top grade Western country like UK, US, that's basically it. But what we're willing to consider is like Anglosphere, really, maybe Australia, maybe
Yeah.
if they're really nice.